Okay, so welcome everyone to Nova Scribes. Thank you very much for attending. It is May 9th, 7 o'clock Eastern time, and we are about to do Shazam, comic style with Trent Wakenight. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a minute. But first, a little bit about Nova Scribes. So those of you that are new to Nova Scribes is an open forum for visual practitioners to share their knowledge. We are anyone who uses visuals to move others. That is graphic facilitators, graphic recorders, scribes, sketchnoters, video scribers, UX designers, and visual consultants. We have organized classes, we have graphic jams, we have open spaces, and now webinars to share skills and learn from each other. A little bit about our upcoming meetups that we have. On May 15th, this is all on the meetup page. On May 15th, kinetic sculpture. So think really large mobiles. Those of you that attended IFVP, International Forum of Visual Practitioners in DC 2016, saw Kevin Reese do a massive kinetic sculpture where he brought in around 150 people to create a future of the visual practice. Graphic Recording 101, this is our basic class. It's going to be on June 6th. And then June 19th, our first offering in design thinking in the visual practice. And I believe Ben Tinker, who just joined us, is going to be one of the presenters on that one, along with Aaron Gordon. So really looking forward to that. So let me go ahead and introduce our speaker, and I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And Trent, if you want to get yours queued up and ready to go while I'm getting this next part out. So it is my privilege and honor to introduce Trent Wakenight. He is one of my closest partners and best friends. And I met him in an elevator. We were both getting onto an elevator, and I had a kit of markers and a roll of paper, and he had a kit and a roll of papers, roll of paper and some markers. And I said, "Hey, what do you do?" And he says, "What do you do?" And you know, we became friends after that, and we worked very closely. And he's developed over the years a very unique style that's reminiscent of comics and comic books, which he's going to be sharing with us tonight. He's the founder of Marker Ninja, and he actually has a couple of books out there. Depending on your political leanings, you may want to check them out, but they're pretty funny. So a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, I'm trusting that everybody can see and hear. If you want to, you can have your cameras on. So Mateos, thank you for the thumbs up. It's always nice to get some visual feedback. Please mute yourself when you are not talking. You will be muted, and just know that if I mute you, it's not personal. The rule is with virtual facilitation that you will be the last person to hear your own background noise, okay? If you want to unmute yourself, it's in the controls at the bottom of your screen, or you can, if you're on by phone, you can hit *6. We are going to be taking most questions through chat. This also goes, this is the same for any kind of tech checks or tech problems you may be having. If you need to send me a back channel note about the technology, please use the chat window for that. And just so that you'll come see it, the chat window is here, okay? So send me issues that way. We may also be posting some useful links and resources in the chat log, and we'll post them into the messages for this meetup. So you can also use Zoom to click through some different views. You can use gallery view or speaker view. You can click the 3 dots to pin a video if there's one person speaking you really would like to follow them. And then also for tonight, I believe we're in for 90 minutes. Is that right, Trent?
That's right, Brian.
Okay, very good. And so just both Trent and I are going to be keeping an eye on the chat. Okay. So let's just do a quick tech check. Those of you that are joining by camera, just give me a thumbs up if you can see and you can hear okay. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Rafaelina. Thank you, Ben. Nice, Mateo. Appreciate that. And so there we go. Trent, anything else before I kick it over to you?
All good. Thank you, Brian. So you should be seeing my face on your screen now. Is that correct? Good. All right. Sorry about the lighting here and so forth. Need to improve my lighting setup, but we'll get to that. So welcome. I think this is a sharing opportunity that I know I've had in the works for a couple years now. Some of you have been on this journey with me over time here, and so I'm glad to bring this information to you, share it with you, and I hope you get some value out of it. just from a technical standpoint, the information that I will be sharing with you will be captured in PowerPoint slides. So this will be very PowerPoint heavy. There will be a lot of PowerPoint information. I know that sounds uncomfortable for some of you, but I found it might be the best way to share a lot of the examples, a lot of the messages, and a lot of imagery that I think will give this session some of its richness. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. So what you should be seeing right now is my PowerPoint screen with a picture of Ant-Man in the upper left-hand corner and the title, How Did This All Start? The Origin Story. Are we good there? All right, getting some thumbs up, very good. Would it be easier if I switched it to PowerPoint display mode? Let's try that here. Is that better for everyone? Preference, getting some thumbs up there, good. All right, very good. So anyone who has been living on the planet Earth over the last couple of years has realized that just about every comic book is being turned into a movie or a TV show or even a Broadway production. And over the last couple of years, we've also seen a lot of what are called origin stories. And so we've seen origin stories for the Ant-Man character. They're in the upper left of the screen. Wonder Woman is a movie that came out a couple of years ago, and I think the second one's coming out next year. Aquaman came out last year. Black Panther is a movie that came out last year and fortunately got some positive reviews even with the Academy Awards. Captain Marvel earlier this year, and then most recently Shazam. And so, you know, because origin stories are such a big part of superhero lore and superhero storytelling, I would like to share with you my origin story and how this all started and why we're here and why I'm interested in sharing with you what you can learn from comic books that will hopefully level up your graphic recording. So here we go. So I've got two versions of my origin story, and here's version one. You know, I was a child of the 70s and 80s, and superhero culture at the time was nerdy. It was far from mainstream. You know, comic books and superhero movies were really for kids. You know, we had the Superman movie that came out around 1978, and then there was a Batman movie in the late 80s. But really, it was Saturday morning cartoons and nerdy comic books. And like many little boys, you know, I was fascinated with all that. I was fascinated with Saturday morning cartoons and after school cartoons and then eventually Star Wars once that became popular as well. And I was also drawn to drawing and movies and stories and began to learn then about the metaphor of the hero's journey and, you know, developing a little bit of that performance artist side. So today, a lot of what I admired about those, I'm now trying to reflect in the work that I do as a graphic recorder, capturing that color and that action and that excitement, the influence of these characters and the drama and the powerful message, the ways that they can help tell a story. With any of our stories, there are sometimes good guys and there are often bad guys. And as graphic recorders, I think we also play kind of a performance artist role at times. So that's version one of my origin story. Here's version two. So here we get into graphic recording. And part of what brings me to you here this evening was also my inspiration to really evolve and make my graphic recordings better. And so really where I started is with my first graphic recording in February 2012. This was part of Deirdre Crowley's class on graphic recording and graphic facilitation. I think some of you or many of you may have taken that course. And I've had a lot of opportunities since then to go back and look at my early recordings. And what I was finding there was putting so much emphasis on catching every word. And I can remember back even to 2012, stepping up to the paper and feeling that anxiety, ready to be judged by others, ready to harshly judge myself. Now, part of that is that I had come from a professional note-taker background. And so as someone who sat at a keyboard and captured meeting minutes, you know, every word was precious to me. So as a graphic recorder, I felt like I need to capture all of this information. I can't let it just disappear. And I I didn't really take the time to think about it or actually try to summarize it, just get it all on the chart. Looking back then, I realized that by 2014 and 2015, after I'd been doing this for a couple years, I'd really gotten into a rut. My charts were hard to follow. I used any color and I used every color. Whatever I brought along with me was, you know, somewhere between my 10 fingers and there at my disposal, and I was using all of it. I was giving very little thought to the kind of tone that was a part of a conversation, the kind of feeling that one might have picked up from comments and presentations, and really not bringing emotion or the emotion of the conversation into my graphic recordings. I'd almost become kind of robotic. Now, if you think about comic books and superhero movies and fine art paintings, there's a tone and there's a mood that's always evoked in those stories. And I look back now and I realize that part of pictures and imagery and superheroes that I had loved as a child, I'd really forgotten about when I was doing work as a graphic recorder, and really left aside that artistic storytelling side. So after one particularly depressing event, I realized that I needed to stop, I needed to think. And in 2015, I went back through my work, and there it was. This is a graphic recording from back in 2012 when I had first started out. And I had to ask myself, what happened between 2012 and now 2015 that had steered me in such a different direction? So the other thing I learned on this journey was to surround myself with other graphic recorders. And up until my collaboration with others had been very, very limited. In 2014, I joined Dean Myers and Brian Tarallo and Heather Martinez at OG Systems. Shortly thereafter, we were joined by Ben Tinker, and then by Lauren Green and Aaron Gordon, and now Trina Kane. I branched out to the meetup group, and I met others like Rachel and Mateo, and others with whom I could develop this collegiality and get feedback and share ideas. And I found that my graphic recording work took an exponential leap. I learned that there's really no substitute for putting your work in front of others and accepting feedback from others who have your best interest at heart. So with that, comic books, the feedback from others, all of that really boiled into my inspiration and inspired me to think about how I could get better at composition, leading readers through my graphic recordings, using color more effectively, obviously telling stories through pictures, which is, you know, the job of the graphic recorder. And these kind of form our objectives for tonight's session together. So let's take a quick look at our objectives here. So here are things I'd like to cover with you tonight. I think first of all that graphic recording, as many of you know, really has that ability to help groups of people congeal around an idea and develop some common understanding. Pertinent to our discussion, I think graphic recording can be a form of art, it can be a form of journalism, and it can be storytelling all in one. And so the lessons I took from comic book writers and artists and examples have now informed my work. We're going to take some time tonight to consider how comic books are laid out in order to optimize how they are read. Another way of looking at this is to examine how our eyes might move across a page and go from one part of a story to the next part of a story, all on one sheet of paper. We know that comic books and storytelling are very character heavy and character focused. I think we could each name at least 15 comic book, cartoon, or comic book characters that are popular or have been popular over time. And we'll take some time to examine how characters can be portrayed in graphic recording. We'll spend a little bit of time looking at color and how it can influence a message or story. And then lastly, I want to share some tools that I take with me on every job, and I hope you'll share some of your tools and tips as well. Unfortunately, we'll mostly be looking at my examples, but I want you to think about your own work and maybe even have some examples by your side there to review as we go along. So here's the format we're going to follow this evening. I'm going to present this session in chapters. We're going to look at examples. We're going to review the lessons at the end of each chapter. And then I'd like to discuss what stood out for you. And so that's an opportunity for you to reflect on what you learned and kind of create a mental map of what you might take away with you. And then at different points here this evening, we'll also have opportunity for practice. So let's dive right in here. Where I want to start here is, first of all, saying, kind of describing what a comic book is. Now, it would be presumptuous for me to believe that all of you spend every Saturday afternoon at the comic book shop reading through comic books, or spend all of your time reading comic strips or watching, cartoons on TV or anything like that. I think we assume that because most of us who have grown up in a US culture are probably familiar with comic books, it's a medium that's been around for decades. The first known comic book is something called The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck. This dates all the way back to 1837. Now, comic books have evolved over the past century, but they still feature that same kind of containerized sequential storytelling format. We're going from box to box in a sequential style that really tell a story as it unfolds from one scene to the next. With the rise of some other types of publications in the last century, in some ways, comic books also became thought of something for little boys. The content was more adventurous, a little more trashy, in some cases, certainly more sexist in its portrayal of female characters. And I can guarantee you that there's at least one of us on this call who was told in elementary school or middle school to put away that comic book, or even had a comic book confiscated. In case you haven't seen more modern comic books, they have really become an art form. Bold coloring, playing with containers and form, the introduction of characters of all types. You'll see the example there on the right. Exit stage left, the Snagglepuss Chronicles. Snagglepuss is a homosexual, anthropomorphic mountain lion who's fighting communism in the 1950s. I don't know if you could get any more variety than that, but look at the example on the right there compared to what we had in the past. And you can really see some of the change that's taken place in the bright, bold colors. Even the scene that this person's drawn extends up beyond the boxes where they have dialogue at the top. So some really incredible things that are happening. There are professional organizations and educational organizations who are also understanding the value of this medium for reaching youth and reaching adults. And of course, we've got all these conversions from comic books to movies, TV, and Broadway. And it seems like the entertainment industry is now starting to learn that there's something special that happens when you tell a story with pictures. We all knew that anyway. We're also seeing graphic novels as another medium where comic book form and illustration is really taking hold. There's an exponential rise in conveying classic literature in graphical form. You can see on the right, everything from Anne Frank's diary to A Wrinkle in Time are now available in illustrated form. I wish I'd had those back when I was in middle school. And so publishers and others are finally beginning to realize what you and I already know, that most people really are visual learners. Another area I want to touch upon is Japanese manga. And illustration and manga and the telling of story with pictures is a visual form that dates all the way back to the 12th century in Japan. One of the interesting things about Japanese culture, if you're familiar with the reading style, is that manga are read from right to left, top to bottom. So, as opposed to English style literature where we're going left to right, here it's right to left. Japanese manga is an art form that really took off in the late 1940s. And part of that was due to US occupation in Japan and the incorporation of Disney characters and some of those imagery. And so then you've got interesting characters like on the left, you've got Astro Boy here, who, if you look at the eyes and you look at the shape of the ears and the nose, really bears a resemblance to some of what you'd see in Disney characters. Japanese artists started to notice what American publishers are doing. And in my opinion, if you really want to see structure and form and storytelling, pick up a Japanese manga, pick up one of these comic books like you see people reading here on the subway, and just study the form of it. It's really fascinating. And of course, then there's another form here. We all are familiar with Sunday Funnies and comic strips, and are familiar with people like Garfield and Kathy and Brian's favorite, Calvin and Hobbes. We know all of those characters. So as I started to understand and examine my own styles of graphic recording, I found that these many forms in comic books could really give me some guidance. It told me things about structure. It told me things about movement of a viewer's eyes through a page. It taught me about coloring and lettering. It taught me ways to draw characters to convey emotion and action. I stepped back, I looked at my own work, and I looked at this kind of unstructured and haphazard approach that I'd used in the past, and how I thought it was really making it difficult for people to follow along with what I was putting up on the page. They didn't know where to start. They didn't know where to look first. They didn't know where to look next. The main points and the punchlines weren't always clear. But over the last couple of years, by studying comics, I realized that if I organized and conveyed my information in a more structured way, I could more rapidly and effectively convey those main ideas. I also learned that I could generate a more impactful emotional response. So with that, I want to stop here for a moment and kind of hear your takeaways and your thoughts to this point. Some of you are probably people who've spent a lot of time reading comic books and looking at comic strips. For others, this might not be very common, but what are your takeaways so far?
Hey there, Trent. Can you hear me?
Yes, Ben.
Perfect. So something that struck me as you were going through that is I was thinking about, graphic recording style and how what I do and what I see others do is the same or different from some of these examples for comic books, and something that may or may not have struck other folks, particularly if you go back on like slide 4 with the modern day comics. A lot of the graphic recording I don't really have sharp edges on images, or, like if I do like a little scene or a little vignette. So like the helicopter over the ocean in the front middle, or in the center there, the top center, I might draw the helicopter in full, and then just kind of like sketch in a little bit of ocean or a little bit of sky behind it, as opposed to putting like a solid frame and really giving it, sort of that very crisp edge, and then relating it to other images around it in the same way. So just that particular frame just struck me as I was trying to begin to relate these new ideas to me, because I didn't read a ton of comic books growing up. Loved Calvin and Hobbes for sure, but just didn't get in as deep as some of my friends did on some of the comic books. So anyway, so the crisp edges.
Yeah, and one of the things, Ben, I'll point out in the example on the left-hand side of your screen, so that white area that you have between different boxes on a page is called the gutter. And I think in graphic recording, I've seen the work of many of the people who are here on the call. We can sometimes use that white space or that gutter there to separate from one main point to the next, in the same way that someone might draw a container around that main point and a container around the next point. So, there are instances where white space alone can be our friend in helping people move from one point to the next. Yeah. What other thoughts or takeaways at this point?
I just like it, and I haven't really thought about it before, and like all the things I can learn from it. So I'm just learning new things, and I love it.
Great. Thanks, Rachel.
Hey, this is Jeanette. Can you hear me?
Yes, Jeanette.
Oh, hey, one realization I had is actually you brought up something that I've always feared, and it's that people can't follow my graphic recordings. You know, like I know what I've done, but I think I haven't always made it easy, even using containers and arrows and things. And people always come up and remark like, "Oh, that's cool," and they might hone in on a cool little Easter egg here or there. But I think the big picture isn't always evidently clear. And it's funny because when I make smaller graphics that explain kind of complex concepts, I use fewer words, more images, and it's much more, clearly laid out. But graphic recording, I just sort of throw it all there, and it's not very organized. So I like the idea of like very closed containers and, a flow that people are used to culturally from the comic books.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. How about one more comment? Any final takeaways from anyone?
Hi, Trent. It's Constance. Can you hear me?
Hi, Constance. Yes. Hi there.
Hi, Trent. Long time no see.
Yeah.
I wanted to just really take a moment to give appreciation for your drawing attention to the high value for the multi-generational reach because of the comic as a medium. I'm a 80s, 90s kid. And so like the funnies in the Washington Post every Sunday was a big deal for me. And then for my dad's generation, that was a big deal for him. And so I thought I think that's a great point. Just that high value, able to reach the multi-generations with this particular format. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a testament to the value of our work. I see, Brian, you got your hand up. Is that for a comment?
It is. Actually, I'm going to voice something that's in the chat from Ashanti. Ashanti says, so are you getting all the main points up front from the speaker? How do you create containers without knowing where the speaker will go next?
All right, so we're going to get into that here in a little bit. Thank you for your question. I think we might answer some of that in the next chapter. And if I don't, we'll come back to that question because it's one that I've heard before and that I do my best to answer and kind of pull out what's happening in my brain when I'm standing there and doing this. Thanks. All right, so let's go to, that was chapter 1. Now let's go to chapter 2 here where we're going to talk about composition. And so, as you're aware by looking at these examples, many comic books and comic strips follow a very traditional format. Left to right, top to bottom, boxes that fit together tightly. But there are some more modern comic books and artists that are starting to push this boundary of the 90-degree corners. And, I'll apologize, they're comic books. Some of the images that are in comic books are a little disturbing or grotesque, but we're talking about good versus evil, and it takes many forms. You'll see this example on the left where this artist for Immortal Hulk, put all of its imagery into spaces or containers, but then twisted a little bit to lead people through the image. I really love this example on the right from the Archie comics. And look at the storytelling that's happening here. First, we've got Archie in the upper left who's, starting out with his guitar solo. And then we move to this panel where now we're seeing him from a back view. And then we're moving to this panel where, he's performing and you get kind of the audience perspective looking up at him. And we see, the fans there in the audience, I guess one of them who's a little upset. And then we've got one more view from the back of the audience, and very few words in this entire comic strip, but this artist has managed to compose it where we move through the story, see it from so many different angles. I just think it's so powerful. It's an amazing image. So one of the neat things about comic books and comic strips especially is the ability to use shapes on a single page to convey a vignette. So for those of us who are graphic recorders, does that sound familiar? We're using shapes to move people through a single story. One of my favorite comic strips is the appropriately named yet unfortunately named Zits, about two parents who are trying to raise a high school teenager. And Jerry Scott and Jim Borgman just managed to tell stories in such wonderful ways. It's more than just the script and the characters, but it's this packaging and the containerization. creating boxes or areas around that content. If you look at Calvin and Hobbes on the right here, you know, Calvin's kind of isolated in the middle where he's wondering about this leaf that's now falling to the ground. Ben, you'd asked about earlier, you'd pointed out some of the sharp corners and edges that comic book artists might confine their messages to. You know, here's Calvin and Hobbes where, you know, in this image, they made use of white space, they put a container in the middle, and so I can flow across that bottom panel there from one strip to the next. Now, you know, it might be assumed that readers really follow this left to right and top to bottom type of pattern. But what's interesting, even as long as comic books have been around, there are still very few studies that really show how readers and viewers navigate the layout of a page. Now, for us as graphic recorders, there are a lot of different elements that we have to consider. These include the color of the panels, the composition within a panel or a section of a graphic recording, the character positioning or the direction of a character's eyes. There are elements used in comic books where they're breaking the borders. So in here, we've got a main character in the middle who's kind of standing out against all of this other messaging that's going on. And there are particular ways in which panels are arranged relative to each other. This is an illustration that was just posted on Instagram earlier this week, either earlier this week or last week, where I can't read much of this. I think it's Dutch. But look at the packaging and look at the panels that this artist has created to lead you through the message and kind of segment the different portions of the story. I need to translate this in some way because this is just wonderful. The way that they've arranged this content here. So for the moment, let's talk a little bit about how content is arranged. Now, I realize that as graphic recorders, we don't always arrange our content in neat boxes, and Ben's question earlier kind of pointed that out. We don't always draw lines around those boxes, and I think it was Ashante who asked about knowing the story or message in advance. You know, we sometimes step to the paper only knowing the title and the speaker's name. What I'll attempt to do here is give you a few compositional tips to think about before you step to that paper and before you start working at the wall. So, you know, one of these tips is thinking about the color that we might use in boxes or using color to connect or disconnect with different parts of the story. This example that you see on the right was at a conference where their primary colors were dark purple, light purple, dark green, lime, red, and pink. Kind of a bizarre composition. And they wanted this one chart that said, okay, go take notes at all of our keynotes, and can you then put them onto one chart? So over the course of 2 days, I would go take some notes, I'd come back and add stuff to the chart, I'd go take more notes, I'd come back and add stuff to the chart. And in this instance, I tried to use their brand colors to really segregate the message from one speaker to the next to the next. So there was one who talked about thinking outside the box. There was another one who talked about adverse childhood experiences. You could see in the right there, a speaker who talked about human trafficking. And so I could have drawn boxes around all of these. I used color to separate from one piece to the next. If this had been one speaker, I imagine I could have done the same thing to lead somebody through the story. Here's one of the other ones, and that is composition within a section. Research on comic book layout is very, very limited. We have enough knowledge to inform kind of the parallels that inform graphic recording and that we can transfer to our graphic recording domain. So in this case, in the lower left, you know, I made this attempt to use this person's gestures and their eye movement to say, I want to move from left to right. We've got this drawing here for the SNAP Ed program in Flint, Michigan, and the use of these banners and these swirls to move from one stage to the next as part of my composition and storytelling. There are other ways that we can move people through a story. One of them might be using word bubbles. Another might be using overlap, and we'll talk about that. And using some of these techniques to show second or third level ideas. So in this example, let's focus just on the upper right. We've got this idea of relationships. And you'll see that banner, intersectionality, kind of a long word. That's what they chose. And so my intent here was to move from this portion on the upper left and use this intersectionality banner to pull thing over to the right. And then we've got the diagram there in the square on the right that shows power and oppression and privilege to kind of pull that theme out. So in this case, you know, using word bubbles, using overlap to lead someone through the composition of this piece. Here's another one. There was a speaker who talked about Brownsville, Texas, and all the vibrant things that were going on, and an attempt to lead a viewer through there, and then segregating this portion on the right that talked about exercise. We're going to look at some examples later where we really get into the science of how we segregate these different areas and how people's eyes might move. So with that, one of the common types of techniques or patterns that's used in comic books and comic strips is the Z pattern. And there are different forms of Z pattern. What I mean by Z pattern is typically for English language readers or viewers, we're following in a Z across the page. So you look at this first example on the left, we have two characters running across a rooftop, and then one of them sliding down the side of the roof. And then for some reason in the middle, we have Robin dressed as a starfish, I don't know why, landing down on this person's face on the lower left. The person falls to the ground, and then Batman is standing over his enemy. And without even trying, you know, I find that my eye flows in this Z pattern from upper left to upper right to lower left to lower right. And so that's a technique that's reflected quite often in comic books and comic strips. The same is true here for this example on the right that talks about the overthrow of Hawaii and how that story came to be, where we're moving even through the way the characters are positioned from left to right, from left to right, down to the lower left, and then down to the lower right. Here are a couple other examples. We already saw this one from Immortal Hulk, where, you know, Hulk, you see him, this character's face that's being punched, and so we follow Hulk's arm up to his face. We move then to kind of in a zigzag down there where some creature is biting into Hulk. We have the female character on the right who's saying he needs help. And there's something going on down in the lower left corner. And then finally with this, this gruesome character in the lower right, the panel or the comic strip you see on the right-hand side really emphasizes that Z pattern and that motion that oftentimes comic book artists are trying to achieve. We also see that in advertising. In fact, it's quite prominent in magazine advertising. These, how many do I have here? 11. These are 11 advertisements from the May 2019 issue of Southwest Airlines. So I grabbed all of these during a flight on May 1st, last week, all from one in-flight magazine. And if you follow the Z pattern here, you see it's pretty prominent. I think the one for me where it stands out the most is with the chili peppers in New Mexico. It's the third from the left. So we've got this headline here, chili capital of the world, true. We might have a chili pepper that's then pointed down to the left-hand bottom corner. And on the right, we've got New Mexico, true, and the URL. And with just about every one of these, you've got a logo or a URL in the bottom right-hand corner. Look at the Barry Manilow Las Vegas example. We've got Barry's arm stretched across the page. I'm going from his right hand to the microphone in his left hand, down through his name to the little logo in the lower left. And if you want tickets, there's the website in the lower right-hand corner. So next time you're on an airplane, here's one tip from me. In-flight magazines oftentimes have wonderful design and a lot you can gather from them. So that's the Z pattern where we're moving along this grid from A to B to C to D. Now here's one where I attempted to do that myself. I started with this discussion about Food Navigator. I have a hand in the top middle reaching down with a spoon, extending all the way over to Good Healthy Food. And the shopping cart then that I purposely angled down toward the lower left corner. There you see the state of Michigan and the Michigan mitten, as we call it. Food Insecure. I purposely directed these arrows pointed to the right, where we then move over to Food Insecurity. And then this banner and this woman with the arms folded, where I wanted to end up over in the right-hand corner. And the speaker said, one of my main points is that we need to reduce shame when helping others make good food choices. That was her primary talking point. And so I tried to lead people through this Z pattern and this A, B, C, D grid. Here's one that I think Brian might find familiar. So this is from Design Thinking DC. More than a year ago, if you ever have the opportunity to team up with Brian on a graphic recording, please say yes. You'll learn a lot. It's a great opportunity. And so, here we attempted our own Z pattern where we moved across the top line. We zigzagged back down to this design theater square in blue. We cut all the way across then through team ideation and then down to concepts in the lower left. One of the things I love most about this is this grounding of the purple box there that leads me then to the very end, the punchline that it takes a diverse team. We need to take time to define our problems. So I thought this was a wonderful use of this zigzag Z pattern. Here's another one where I attempted to do the same thing. You see prototype warfare and DoD in a data-driven age. So this was a sketch note that I then colored using Photoshop. So we go from the title to the upper right, where we then talk about artificial intelligence and computer vision and machine learning, back down to the Project Maven title and what that's all about. You'll see the orange box at the bottom, unleash the culture that goes from small to big. And then these main points, start small, stay focused, win early. So, my attempt to follow this A, B, C, D, Z pattern throughout this particular sketch note. There are other ways to use the Z pattern. And we're going to talk next about B, which is blockage. To some, this might seem like interference. And so here's an example of how one might interpret blockage. So in this panel on the left, you can see that we're going from the character's quotations in the upper left to this character holding his head and saying, and then the red arrow directs us down to the cue. The other way that people might interpret blockage is to go from that upper left square to then the square that's in the middle on the left, and then back up to the right. In fact, quite often we see that this example on the right is actually the pattern that people follow. So if you follow the squares A, B, C, you're going from upper left to middle left, then to this larger rectangle that's on the right-hand side. Brian, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to read a question from Hannah. For the fill colors in the boxes, are you using Neuland big ones or a larger size?
I use the Neuland big ones for those. You can see this example here from Bruce Van Patter where he's used pastels. I've got another example in here where our colleague Dean Myers uses pastels. I don't have a preference either way, although I know that the pastels tend to get all over my clothes and my shoes a lot more rapidly than the markers do. So Bruce gave me his permission to use his examples here. And when we talk about this theme of blockage, I love how he uses blockage in his work. My attention through his use of color, through this solid black line, really becomes isolated to this portion on the left. And I want to read all the way through that. And then I move over to this middle section, the how, take a walk, change location, gather data, what's behind the trigger. And look at that red squiggly line he put in there. he's really cordoned off these areas and used the idea of blockage to move me from one section to the next to the next. And I think back to some of my old graphic recordings and even my current ones. I don't always give people this opportunity or this luxury to say, where do you want me to focus first? And what do you want me to read before I go on to the next section? Bruce does this in marvelous ways because, you know, if you've ever seen his work, he's a marvelous graphic recorder. Brian, yes.
Reading another question from Hannah, would you ever actually draw the arrows in to make your blocking obvious?
So there are instances where I have used arrows filled with text. You could use arrows as a container. Going back to one of the examples I used earlier, you might use a ribbon of text to lead someone from one section to the next. There was that sketch note you'll see in the bottom there where I changed the size of my text box at the bottom to intentionally lead someone from small to large and get them to move, not just naturally in that direction, but to give them really the inclination to move that way. So, you know, Bruce Van Patter's work here again, using blockage and saying, I want you to read this stuff on the left before you get over to reading about fight, flight, freeze, and appease. I think this one is one of my favorites, and look at some of the blockage that Bruce has used here. We've got the square or the rectangle in the upper left. We've got this section in the lower left that's kind of been pocketed down there by itself. We've got this text that's cutting through the middle that says, don't use old payments. And then he's using these, you know, back to Hannah's question, he's using the word speed and this flash of blue and white to move over to the next box. And then in the upper right, this solid red line that says, I want you to focus here now. Read this before you go anywhere else. I've tried to do that myself, and here's an example where in this case, this organization was talking about 7 different applications that they were using. And so those are listed on the right, but I wanted to get their title in there and really make that stand out. So in this particular structure, I used blockage almost in an opposite way. My intent was to get someone to read all the way down top to bottom on the left, and then bounce back up and read all the way through these different applications. One of the cool things about this is that this organization was also using the acronym MTG. And so I got permission to use an MTV type of theme and go back to kind of a, you know, an 80s, 90s type of reference. You've seen this one before, and we talked a little bit about blockage where in this case, you know, similar to Bruce's style, I tried to really isolate this section on the right-hand side and gave it a bold red line to say, you know, contain your idea and your readership within this portion before you look at others. So one of the other techniques with the Z pattern is something we call overlap. And in this case, we're looking at a pretty old Black Panther comic book from the 1970s. Don McGregor is the artist. And what really stands out here is that section in the middle where we've got the, you know, the eyes of this mysterious, odd creature. And as much as I'm drawn to the stuff on the left and the stuff on the right, Don McGregor here has used overlap as a technique to really make a point with this character in the middle and really draw your attention to what he has to say. Here's another instance, and you know, we've got this section on the left-hand side that's really different from anything else in this particular drawing. And so the idea is I want you to read this particular piece first and get some context for what you're about to read in the rest of the comic strip. Brian, yes.
Reading from, excuse me, reading from the chat. Piotr asks, just wondering about when to use arrows and when to use color to lead how people view as those fulfilling similar functions. The same with hard containers versus coloring used as container. When to use which if their function is similar?
So if I'm reading the question correctly, it's when you might use arrows versus using color to go from one panel to the next. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Peter, give a thumbs up.
Yeah, you know, I think it would, so I would invite others to weigh in on this. My personal opinion is that it might depend on the style of the drawing you are trying to use. So for example, if we go back to, you know, Bruce's example and that word speed cutting through the middle, you know, there's very little blue anywhere else in this drawing. And so he used this burst of blue and white, you know, almost as an arrow, but not necessarily drawing an arrow. So he used color in this instance. If we go back to an example I shared earlier, you know, here on the left-hand side, I've got the words able and flexible and impactful as these words and these lines trying to move someone to the next. And then you'll see this ribbon of text on the right-hand side. Food is more than sustenance. So I think oftentimes words can act as an arrow. These ribbons of text can act as an arrow. If, you know, if the drawing calls for it or the topic calls for it or it's your personal style, you could draw an arrow to lead people there as well.
One more comment from the chat, question really. How much of the really colorful work are you doing live, and how much color, structure/color are you adding after the discussion/presentation ends? That's from Angie.
Yeah, thanks, Angie. It will vary. I try to do as much as I can when I'm there live. And what that means is, you know, I think in the graphic recorder brain, we're remembering what was heard a minute ago. Well, let me back up. We're remembering what was heard 3 minutes ago. We're remembering what was heard a minute ago. And we're remembering what's being heard in real time while at the same time drawing. I think I've kind of, for myself, put in that fifth piece here, which is let's color this all in at the same time and move as quickly as we can. Now, that doesn't mean that, you know, I'm done every single time. There are a lot of times where I might walk away and say, I'm going to finish that up this weekend, or I'm going to finish it up tonight and take a photograph and send it back to you. So, you know, I love those opportunities where conferences or speakers take long breaks, because then I can stand there further at the paper and start to fill this thing in. Let me keep your question in mind, because I may have a few examples here where I have completed it all in one shot, done it live and said, here you go. And others that, you know, I spend the weekend finishing up. So we were talking about overlap. Here's another example of overlap. In the panel on the left, you see we've got these two characters. I think it's Gambit and Nightcrawler, who were there, you know, talking to one another. And you can see that not only do they overlap, but they also overlap two panels and that white gutter line that's across the middle. So, you know, in this case, the artist is using the Z pattern, and they're using this overlap to really draw me down to that lower left corner. The example on the right from Power Rangers, I emphasize this one. Really, the overlap here is the character's head. I think that's really interesting how they've used the dimensions or the physicality of that character as the overlap versus a text box or some other type of container. It was one of my attempts at overlap. As I went through this graphic recording and I heard the speaker talking, you know, one of the things they then talked about was the value of design thinking. I said, I need to catch that. I need to make that a main theme, because that's what I'm hearing in the presentation. So in this case, you know, you're obviously seeing just a portion of the graphic recording here, but now I've got this circle at the bottom that pops out and overlays on other content to establish the value of design thinking. Back to the question about how much of this I do on site. In this case, this is one that I did right there on the spot and just cranked it out. Had my light blue 303 Neuland and my 500 or whatever it is Neuland yellow, and really worked through these. So this one's pretty crazy. And I share this one for a couple reasons. One, my attempt to use the Z pattern. Number two, my falling back into some old habits of trying to capture every word possible. And then number three, I think I could have been a lot more conscious about color choice with this one. This was done for a law firm whose corporate colors were hot pink, lime green, and gray. And if I'd been a little bit smarter about this, I might not have used hot pink, lime green, and gray in my graphic recording, because that's pretty nauseous here. What I'm trying to emphasize for you is this idea of overlap. And if you look at the bottom of this picture of this graphic recording, you can see the ribbon going across this. You know, we're seeing divergence in law firm performance. That was one of the takeaway messages. And so I created a space at the bottom to really emphasize that particular message and make it, you know, an area of overlap from one panel to the next. Now, you know, I guess the other thing I would say about overlap is that it can also work in very subtle ways within sections of a graphic recording. In this case, for a graphic recording at a health conference, you'll see I've got this yellow street sign, be bold and ambitious, and then this yellow or this white with blue piece of paper laid over it. And then on top of that is this box that says you need science, political will, community support, and social media. So, you know, with this particular conference going in, one of the things I said was, I want to use more overlap. I want to give my sketch more dimension. And so there are probably about 6 different levels of dimension within this particular sketch. And, you know, I know why Brian's smiling, because, you know, this was my first opportunity to draw flaming underwear and an eggplant. That was a fun conference. I'll pause there in case anyone missed that. All right, let's continue. If you would like to know more about composition and navigating comic books, and really want to start positioning your composition, this is a little graphic that I printed out and I take with me when I go to do graphic recording. And so, you know, look at this topmost box here. Remember I'm going to flash back here for a moment. Sorry. Remember the Z pattern where we talked about A, B, and a larger C box on the right? So what does that really mean? From a scientific perspective, it means that if you have that large box on the right, in this study, only 9% of readers are going to go to the right, that red arrow. Most of them are going to go down. But if you change the height of that box on the right, it changes which way they may go. So what I'm saying here is we have opportunity to really be intentional about where we want to lead readers from one place to the next. And another opportunity, if you really want to geek out on this, entry points, overlap, inset. If you look up comic book composition and this author or publisher's name, Steranko, you will find examples like this, where you can position boxes and really, as I said, geek out on composition. So the last principle that I want to share with you comes from photography. And there are probably many of you have heard of the rule of thirds. And it's often used as a way to improve composition in photographs. The basic premise is to imagine a photograph separated into thirds with 2 lines coming from the top and 2 lines coming from the side, and ultimately you end up with 9 rectangles. And the idea is that the horizon in a landscape photograph would fall on an imaginary line running along the upper third or the bottom third, and any of these objects of interest might intersect on any one of these lines. So for example, you've got the image in the left-hand side of the girl and the cap looking into the distance. You can see the landscape occupies that lower third. She falls right on the line where the lines intersect. And so in this particular photograph, your attention is drawn to that element. The same is true with the dog there and the boy running with the cape. So, the question would be, could that apply to graphic recording? Here again are some of my examples. In this case, in the example on the left with the blue and the gray and the purple, I tried to use these, the rule of thirds to really segregate these three sections, and then the slanted lines to take advantage of this kind of Z pattern. You'll see the concentric circles there in intersecting one of those lines where it says automation. Again, the same idea. I needed and wanted to draw attention to that particular piece. In the example on the upper right, without me really even thinking about the rule of thirds, this is kind of how it ended up. I ended up with this rocket ship on one of the lines, and then this primary theme of journey to success across the top and in the middle. And then the example on the right, as some of you may know, 2 years ago, I published a book called The First 100 Days of the Trump Presidency. I honestly would have created these sketch notes in this book, no matter who had been elected. It was a momentous time in our country's history. I didn't think I would continue drawing this particular story past 100 days. Not because I've gotten tired of it. I thought the political climate might change, but hey, here we are. My point with this particular one is I attempted to use the rule of thirds here, where we've got the title First 100 Days across that upper line. We've got the specific date, January 26th, falling on one of those lines. And then that vertical line on the right, we've got the main character's face lined up right there to draw the reader into it. So the rule of thirds can, be a powerful tool that you take along with you and think about in advance as you're standing there at the wall. So composition, this is the longest chapter that we will cover tonight. So let's pause, let's catch our breath. We're going to do a quick review. So some of the things we talked about were traditional comics with those 90-degree corners. We talked about some more modern comics where they're using angled boxes and angled containers and shapes. We talked about the traditional Z pattern from A to B to C to D. We talked about blocking, overlap, the rule of thirds. And if you were just to go online and search with the terms comic book composition, you will find so much more. So we're just at the tip of the iceberg here in terms of what you could learn from comic books and how you might apply it. So let's have a quick discussion. I'm curious, what stood out for you from this particular section, and what caught your attention and caught your interest?
So this is Lauren. I had noted this in the chat, but I was just I was noticing that I almost always end on the top right, and if I have any kind of composition, it's left to right or maybe a U, but always ending in the top right. So what I appreciate is this idea of really putting some intention and considering other options.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lauren. And I will share. Lauren's seen me do this. There are times before a presentation where I will step to the board and maybe start sketching out some squares and circles and lines just to kind of, preset where I might want this content to end up. So what stood out for others?
Trent, this is Melissa. I'm new to the group. I met Brian and I don't live in DC, so I'll be joining hopefully some more of your virtual meetings of this group. But what I loved was the Must Take Away banner that spans through several different boxes and kind of crosses the white space. I like that.
Who else? What else stood out for you?
This is Rachel. Something that I knew, but it was nice to be reminded of is fewer words, because I get caught up in trying to catch all the words. And so I think that something recently reminded me of that. And so that was nice. And it's also nice to see it, like how comic books and like all the composition things have a lot of them have very, very few words, but they still tell the story. So it's just kind of something that's really nice to be reminded of.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. So let's go to our next step here. Brian, yep.
A couple things in the chat. So Heather says, I love the colored backgrounds. I have a gig coming up, and this is a great approach.
Thanks, Heather.
Angie says, I understood about when you color your notes, but I am curious about the layout. You sketch boxes and circles in pencil, but how do you decide how big before you know what the speaker will say?
So the boxes and the circles and shapes I draw in advance are not boxes and circles and shapes that I always adhere to. You know, it's kind of a dance where I think, you know, what is my footwork going to be like before the music starts? But once the music begins, you know, I'm starting to learn the song. And so a box that I drew small might end up being a box that becomes much bigger. And so it's rolling with the content there. But at a minimum, you know, maybe sketching it out in advance along the rule of thirds or along a Z pattern, just to prep my thinking. So I'd like to go along to our next step here. And this is where I'd love for you to do a little practicing. So have your pencil, your marker, your paper, your digital tools ready. And here's the scenario. I would like you to use some of the composition techniques you've heard about here in this scenario. A girl is walking to school. She arrives at school and takes off her coat. She walks to her desk. She sits at her desk and she proclaims, "Here I am again, still looking for the answers." And so let's take 3 minutes to kind of sketch that out. It can be a rough sketch. If you just want to scribble it out in pencil, if you want to do it with marker, anything like that. Use your blue art pencil, whatever you'd like. And then, you know, for anyone who'd like to show off their sketch, you can hold it up to the camera or show it digitally, whatever you're comfortable with. So while you're doing that, I'd like to share with you a few sources from which I draw inspiration. One is to simply go online and do Google searches for comic books and cartoons and comic strips, and you know, see what examples are out there and what new techniques I can learn. Another resource that I use are, you know, magazine advertisements, and you saw those examples from Southwest Airlines magazine that I ripped out of the magazine and put into my file. Over here on my shelf, I have what are called my TAER folders, T-A-E-R. And anytime I come across a graphic, a postcard, a magazine ad that I really like, it gets torn out and put into those folders. And then the next time I have a design project, I can shuffle through there and pick out 4 or 5 that really seem to fit with what I'm trying to achieve. My other source of inspiration are beer bottle labels. And if you've ever gone to, you know, Wegmans or the grocery store or somewhere else and stood there in front of all the beer bottles, there's some amazing design on beer bottle labels and amazing color composition and wording and just real artistry that's gone into it now. And so, you know, the next time you're at a grocery store, even if you're not going to buy beer, go and take a look at those labels. All right, so we've hit our 3-minute mark. And so I'd love to, Brian, you might have to help me out here. I'd love to see in examples that anybody might be interested in sharing. So I think I have to hit my stop share. That'd be right? Or are you in control of that, Brian?
Go ahead and stop your share if you don't mind.
Got it.
There you go. And what I'll do is I'll spotlight the video if anybody would like to share. Oh, so we've got Barb. Barb, hold it for just a second. So, spotlight the video. Okay. We're looking at Barb's.
I love it.
Beautiful.
Great. Thanks, Barb.
All right. Moving over to Lauren, spotlighting her video.
Oh, cool. Here I am. That's awesome.
Let's go to Mateo next.
Here, the Z pattern.
I got Mateo up.
Yep. Look at
And then we'll do Rachel and then Heather.
Left to right, down to the bottom. Awesome.
Okay, and then Rachel.
Awesome, Heather.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's go over to Heather. Wait,
Oh,
she left.
no, I'm here. I thought I already did it.
Yep,
already
we saw
shared
Did
Heather.
you?
No.
Oh, sorry.
Nice.
No, I don't think we did. We saw Rachel
No, I
just a
didn't
second
see
there. That was Rachel.
Oh, look at the angle there, the tennis shoes. We got Melissa there, Brian.
You like my belly
Okay,
button?
going to Melissa.
I like the belly button. Yes, very nice.
This is Melissa's.
Cool. There's the coat going off, sitting at the desk. That's awesome. And then I see
And
Deborah.
it looks like we've got, last one is Deborah.
Cool. Nice work. Look at
All
that.
right.
All right. So Deborah, I love it. And I want to share with you where my inspiration came from. So Brian, do you need to turn share over to me?
I think you can go ahead and share. Just it's at the bottom of your screen.
Yep, here you go.
There you go.
All right. So I will tell you this particular scenario did not come out of my head. Oh, I'm trying to advance to my next slide here. It came out of Peanuts. So there we go, walking to school, taking off the coat. So we're going from A to B to C down in the corner to sitting at the desk. And you know, I don't know about you, but my eyes very naturally follow that Z pattern all the way through. You know, Charles Schultz probably had a little bit more than 3 minutes to draw this. But you know, some of you drew things that were really cool departures, and some of them were, you know, spot on with what he had in mind here as well. So let's move to our next chapter here now. And I'm going to pick up the pace because I'm conscious of our time frame here. We did composition, so let's talk next about eye movement. So what does that mean? So comic book and comic strip artists are experts in leading the eye. In other words, helping readers understand where to start and where to go next. Here's a really cool example. So in this example, we are led by the physical drawings of doorways and staircases, the angles at which we see the character. We see the character looking to the left or looking to the right. We've got a back view, we've got a front view. We follow the movement through the character's eyes. So this view down the stairs or down the hallway are through this person's eyes. Look at the cereal bowl, even leading us in a particular direction. And even the tip of the character's nose tells us where to look next. So by contrast, I look at a lot of my own graphic recording, and the characters I draw are just looking straight at the viewer, you know, right, you know, nose to nose, two eyes to two eyes. And I've started to realize that I could provide so much more indication of where to look if I just moved the character slightly or showed them from a side view. This also keeps with, you know, kind of the traditional, this example here is kind of with the traditional style of the 90-degree corners in the boxes that are a very similar size. In this example, you see also where this flow of eye movement from the eagle, we've got this blockage box here down to the bottom and then up through the eyes. And the wonderful things that are being done just here with the characters' expressions and where they're looking, the angles from which we're seeing characters. So here's a really cool example. This is from Jack Kirby, who's was a famous comic book artist. And what's really interesting to me is the absence of text. In other words, we are told where to look just through the movement of these bodies and these characters. Again, you know, the boxed style of traditional comic book art, but the movement of their fists and their hands and their feet tell us where to look next. So what happens when we stop using that traditional grid? In this case, you know, kind of a gruesome example here, but it does show where with these orange arrows, or even with the blue arrows, where I might be led to next. We've got this angular box in the middle on the left that leads me down to the next panel. And then we've got a character leaping downward, which takes me to the lower left corner. And so in this case, there's opportunity to achieve this flow that the author really wanted to take us through. Here's an interesting example. So on the left, you've got the artist who took advantage of this natural eye flow in the way that they constructed the page. We're going in this zigzag Z pattern. But the other thing that's cool is that the actual artwork within each one of these containers also leads the viewer. So you see on the right-hand side, these red arrows, it's the actual drawings themselves that also take us through the panels. And true to graphic recording, where some examples don't have boxes or containers of the traditional grid, we can still lead people through based on where characters are looking or where they're moving or the angle at which they're twisted or turned. You know, this panel on the left from a comic book called Dream Life, really walking from this doorway through the kitchen down to the woman there cutting at the kitchen counter and down to the bottom of this piece. There's really some interesting drama that's going on there, and it's led me through this entire story. So also closer to graphic recording are some examples where the use of words and word bubbles can also lead the eye. This particular framework by Todd Klein is one that I carry with me when I do graphic recording. So it reminds me, where do I want to place these word bubbles to then get people to flow through in a Z pattern or a zigzag type of style. Here's a nice example of that kind of concept that Todd Klein was describing, where if you follow the red line, you can see these word bubbles take me all the way through the drawing from the start of the dialogue to the end of the dialogue in a really powerful way. This last example, I think, really brilliantly ties all of these contexts together. So in one case, you've got the gaze of the characters, where in the upper left, the character is looking upward. In the upper right, you've got the character looking down and looking at a word bubble. You've got them meeting eye to eye in the middle. You also have this Z pattern that we learned about earlier. The characters' movements and their gestures also lead us through. In that third panel in the middle, you've got Batman's right hand as a part of the movement. And then that fourth panel, you've got, maybe it's Robin, whose left hand is leading us down the hallway there. And then, of course, the word bubbles that take us all the way through as well. This is another example that I carry with me in my little flip book examples to learn from and see what I can do to capture some of the same type of idea. So enough examples from comics. Let's take a look at a few from graphic recording. So this is a sketch that I put together for my father-in-law. He used to work for NASA, and he was one of the very first people, humans in human history, to ever handle the moon rocks. And so I wanted to commemorate that by creating this sketch kind of his career with NASA. And you know, somewhat intentionally, I tried to draw these connections from one panel to the next. And so you can see I threw in some arrows where I was intentionally trying to say, look here next, go here next in this particular comic strip that I sketched out. Here's another one of a graphic recording where I was much more conscious of how I wanted to arrange my word bubbles, where I wanted to arrange the movement of people to really lead someone all the way through these 3 rows of this particular drawing. Someone was asking earlier, you know, do you do all this color fill on the spot? This was an example where after I'd sketched out most of this and the talk was done, I had an extra half hour during a break and I just filled it all in and got it all done. You know, this is one that I think, you know, in different ways takes people through these Z patterns, whether in a large scale or a smaller scale. You've seen this one before. again, an attempt to use this eye movement throughout, where I've got this twisted document on the left-hand side where it says, we have learned these things, to lead people down to the lower left. And then the little girl at the community garden, the woman doing Zumba, the person on the bike, again, kind of leading this motion here through the drawing. Here's one from Bruce Van Patter. You've seen this before. And again, some of the movement and emotion, the objects that he's used to draw people from one thing to the next. Another one from Bruce, and what I find fascinating about this particular one is it's maybe not even so much the movement of words or the movement of objects that's taking someone through, but look at the angles. The only real, 0-degree angles, level lettering in this entire thing is down on the lower right and down at the very, very bottom. Look at this stuff on the left that's slanted upward and then slanted downward and then slanted up again, to really force me to kind of ride this roller coaster here through his drawing and tell me where I should be going next.
Trent, there's a quick question in the chat, if I may, from Angie. She has a random thought.
Hi, Angie.
I haven't grown up with comic books. Do you find that thinking like a comic book artist makes you want to draw on portrait pages rather than landscape?
So I am glad you asked that. And I would be curious, how many others here in this session have flipped their paper and drawn it in portrait format. If I have the opportunity, I love doing it in portrait format versus landscape. When we use our styrofoam walls, Lauren's holding up her sketch notes that she's doing in portrait format. When we take with us our Neuland walls or our foam walls, oftentimes, those are preset, those are landscape format. And if I have a wall that's, ceiling to floor and there's no chair rail or anything else, at times it's very refreshing to do it in a portrait style format. So, if it's something you haven't done before, maybe challenge yourself. This last example I'm sharing here from eye movement is one of my forms of inspiration. This is an artist named Max Grundy. And obviously, you can see that automobiles and trucks are a big theme for Max. But what I want to point out here is that eye movement. And you look at the example on the left-hand side of the purple and white car. And I don't know about you, but I start with those nuclear power plants in the back. And then I've got the UFO, and then I've got a bigger UFO, and then I've got this car that's racing off the page. And any one of his visuals you look at here, there's so much depth and there's so much dimension. And he's leading me through the drawing just in the way he's positioned himself, positioned the objects and the angles of the objects. I love this example here. So I think that takes us to the end of our section on eye movement. I'm conscious that we're coming up on 8:30 here, so let's just do a quick review. That's the wrong review. All right, sorry, wrong slide. Right place, wrong slide. We talked about eye movement and how characters can be a part of eye movement. So let's go to a quick discussion, maybe 5 minutes or less. What stood out for you as a part of this section on eye movement? Nothing is an acceptable answer, but I hope something stood out for someone.
The one thing, and obviously this was the point, I think, but if you're not cognizant of eye movement, you could unintentionally create confusion for the reader of the art.
Yeah. I look at a lot of my old examples and I am just creating confusion all over the place. I haven't necessarily gotten better, but I know what you mean, Ben.
I am really struck by how many opportunities we have to control the eye movement that I hadn't thought about. Everything from the angle of the text to the boxes that I see. You had 2 boxes in that exercise. There was the piece of paper, but then the box next to it repeated that shape. but you had two arrows, one leading to the first piece of paper and then the bikes, and then even everything from the direction of the eye movement of the characters that you're drawing. It's like, I just hadn't even thought about how much control I have over where I want them to be looking.
Yeah, yeah.
Nice.
You go back to that very first example in the black and white where even the character's nose is telling me where to go next. I saw that Marceline had her hand up.
Yeah, so just kind of wanted to reinforce what you just said, that the layout of not just the boxes, but also the text, how that influences how the readers look at it. The bubbles I found going throughout was particularly helpful. I think that'd be great for graphic recording, but also the figures, you know, where they're standing, where they're looking, because I'm also trying to shift from that one-dimensional to that angled. That just reinforces the knowledge that that's something to really work on. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We do have a couple of folks who've weighed in on the comments here as well. Hannah pointed out, you know, one of the things that she took away is you sometimes have one overall Z pattern, or you might have some mini Z patterns within different sections. Peter talked about working with angle and depth from those examples we saw just a few slides ago. And Ashanti said, you know, I learned that I don't necessarily need to rely on arrows so much, that there may be other ways to direct people. Anyone else?
Hannah had a comment. She says, have you ever done a straight overhead view? Toes and noses. Very important there. I'm curious how you handle that.
Oh, yeah. You know, I know we aren't going to get to it tonight, but I had some comic book examples in here where the artists have drawn people from a ground view or from a top view. And I can't say that I've really ever tried that or mastered that, but what a powerful way to really tell a story. I think the closest I've come, you know, one of the themes I was drawing a month or two ago at a conference was something called adverse childhood experiences. And I drew a child with their head down and drew them from a top view, almost the view of a parent or an adult. And I stepped back and said, why haven't I tried this before? So you're right. You know, we don't always have to draw people like we're looking them straight in the eye. So we're a little bit past 8:30. Brian, what do you say? I'll keep going if others want to keep going.
Yeah, I think that's fine. If anybody has, yep, Mateo's got a thumbs up, Rachel's got a thumbs up. Sure. You know, Trent, I want to be cognizant of your time, and if other people have other appointments they need to drop off, no problem there. Do you have more content that you'd like to share, or do you want me to go ahead and stop the recording and we can make this a little bit more conversational? What would you prefer?
I can definitely share more content. So I think the other chapters that I could share a little bit about are on people, drawing people and characters. So maybe we want to explore that. Color in comic books and how color is used and how we might draw from that. And then I just had one slide that was a photograph of some of the tools that I take with me. So why don't we just keep chugging along here?
Sounds good.
All right. So let's go to people. There we go, drawing people. All right. Cool, here we go. So, you know, for anybody who has read comic books or read comic strips or the Sunday Funnies, I think one of the things you'll realize that I have is that it's really about character development. It's what's going on with that particular person or character. And the artists who work in comic books and comic strips have really mastered the ability to tell the story of these characters through their expressions and through their movements and the angles from which we view the characters. You know, Dilbert is one of those examples. And you can see in the upper right, you know, if you know Dilbert, that the characters really are, they're kind of one-dimensional. But then they'll have these little quirky expressions or a little turn of the head or something that, you know, really helps tell the story in a very subtle way, but a very impactful way. So for graphic recording, you know, our topics aren't always so character driven. We cover technology, engineering, science, social and humanitarian issues, vision, strategy, food and health, defense, security, government. And these are not topics that necessarily focus on people, but I like to think that people are central to all of these topics. So before we go any further, one of the expectations I want to set is that this particular chapter is a little bit mislabeled. I'm not going to actually teach you how to draw people. There are people like Jim Nuttall and Greg Gersh and Michaela Lewis and others who have far more expertise and can teach you a lot more than I ever could. And if you were to do just a quick online search, you will find thousands of references that teach you how to draw people. You can stand at the checkout line at Michael's Art Supplies, and there are books there at the point of purchase that teach you how to draw characters. What I'd really like to do here is frame a mindset on how we can draw people in graphic recording to more richly tell a story and convey meaning and further the viewer's understanding. You know, to back my own belief, I've kind of taken that on as I've taken on becoming a better people artist in 2019 and trying to level up my skills in that way. As an example, here are examples on ways just to draw Superman, one character. And look at all of these different expressions and tilts of the head and direction of the head. And he's looking up, he's looking down, he's looking off into the distance. He's got a little bit of a smirk, he's angry. I mean, we're just talking about one character here and all the different emotions and messaging that can be sent just by drawing him in different ways. In these examples, you see characters drawn at different sizes. Some are small, some are big. You see them drawn from the back. You see them drawn from the front. To someone's comment earlier, you see them drawn from different depths of field or angles. Others we might see from an overhead view. And so, you know, so many different ways that we might position people within our graphic recordings to enhance that story. And, you know, I'll go back to some of my earlier drawings and even my recent ones where my people are all the same size. They're all looking directly at the viewer. They all kind of have the same smiling face. And you know, my mission for 2019 is to think, how can I draw them differently to better tell that story? Here's another example, all from the Snagglepuss Chronicles. And look at the different ways that people are drawn in this particular one, this middle panel especially. Here we've got the top view, and then we've got someone pointing a finger. We've got just the heads and shoulders here of people going into a theater. We've got the back view of people sitting in a bar listening to music. And just these three panels, you know, teach us so much about how we could draw people differently. One of my favorite examples is from the comic book strip, or the comic strip Zits, you know, where you've got this husband and wife, or man and woman, who are raising a teenage son. And, you know, Jerry Scott and Jim Borgman have really mastered almost every possible posture and expression and movement that you'd really associate and expect with a teenager, and the two parents are trying to survive. You've got the kid here, you know, in one scene he's slouched over, in another scene he's, you know, he's hooked on his iPhone or his smartphone. On another one, he's giving his mother kind of an annoyed look. Another one, you can see him sleeping on the couch. I mean, so many cool ways that they've mastered drawing these different characters to really convey the emotion of that scene. So where does this lead us all as graphic recorders? So just recently, I went back to 4 graphic recordings that I produced for an event in March. And this slide and the next slide show all of the people that I drew in those 4 graphic recordings. And going back, I started to realize that my people were pretty non-expressive or really didn't convey the meaning as well as they could have. You know, I've got this guy in the middle at the top where it says "we the people," and he's saying, "Who is the we?" I mean, he has a little bit of a sneer, but how could I have made him a little bit angrier? Maybe it's also a hand on the hip. We've got in the middle, the woman with the headband here. It says, "People of color care most about environmental issues." You know, she's got an arched eyebrow, but could I have drawn her in a way that showed that maybe she's a little bit more annoyed than I might have, you know, been conveying here? Here are a few more from those same graphic recordings where, you know, the person in the upper left, the two people in the middle on the left really could have been so much more expressive, and I could have done more with them. So, you know I'm being a little self-critical, but my takeaway, I'm seeing where I need to improve. So what if I tried something closer to this? So this chart on the left was created by our amazing colleague, Heather Martinez, as part of a class taught by Christine Mishiyama. And, you know, on the right, I'm contrasting two of my recent drawings. The guy at the top could have been a little bit angrier, could have been a little bit more expressive. And these people at the bottom who are dealing with food insecurity, they don't really look sad, they just look kind of puzzled. And so what could I have learned from Heather's sketches here to really emphasize some of the emotion that I was trying to draw out? Last of all is this wonderful guide done by Michaela Lewis. And this prompted me not only to think about my characters' expressions and how they could be different, but how I could direct their gaze. And this could give them some more visual interest rather than just gazing directly at the viewer. It could also lead the eye, going back to our discussion of eye movement. So with that, drawing people, let's pause, let's catch our breath a little bit, let's do a little quick review. So here's my note to myself. I will break out of my rut by remembering movement, angles from which a character is viewed, top down, bottom up, from the back, from the side, the angle of their gaze, expressions and emotions, characters drawn in all different sizes, and how all of these can enhance eye movement. So let's pause there. What stood out for you?
It's Mateo jumping in. I love the use of perspective and really just three-dimensionality, right? So pivoting and changing where, quote unquote, the camera might be positioned for a particular section of the drawing. That's fantastic. So thanks for bringing my attention to that.
Yeah, thanks, Mateo. So we have a couple comments in the chat. You know, Brian says avoiding front on and side view heads, instead drawing, you know, heads at a 3/4 angle or a 3/4 tilt in a way to give them a little more dynamic life and make them less flat and less static. Marcelin says, you know, I'm going to make my own character who likes to move around a lot, get all the angles down. Rachel talks about practicing dynamic heads and faces. And Marcelin's even named her character, we've got Scriber Woman. Ashante says that the diversity of expression adds to the overall look and feel of a graphic. And diversity expression adds to that feel. Cool. What other thoughts on what stood out for you? All right, well, let's go to the next piece here. So how about a little practice here of what we've learned? So let's take 3 minutes here. We're gonna do a speed round, and I'm gonna ask you to draw 3 characters. The first one is a man talking into a banana like a telephone, and he's having an angry conversation. The second one, a woman is the CEO of her company and giving a presentation to motivate employees. And then the third one is a child reading a book to his dog, and it's a sad story. So go ahead and take 3 minutes and just scribble these out based on what we've talked about. So while you're sketching those out, one of my practices that I'll share with you in finding ways to draw people more effectively or with more expression is to do online searches for just stock photos of people who are having an angry conversation, or people who are slapping high five to one another, or shaking hands, or holding a box in their arms, or pushing a shopping cart, and actually to throw those into an app like Illustrator and just trace them and get a feel for what that's like and start to develop some of that muscle memory, so that when I go to do my graphic recording and I step up to the paper, I've already developed kind of, I have somewhere in my mental filing cabinet kind of that sense of how I want to draw that particular character, and have practiced that in advance to know that, if somebody talks about a consumer who's shopping, I've already drawn at some point somebody pushing a shopping cart, so I have a feel for what that might look like. All right, so we're coming up on 3 minutes here. So Brian, I'm going to go out of stop sharing mode for anyone who would like to share their images of an angry man talking into a banana, or there we go, Mateo's got it. Oh, there's Brian. Okay. Perfect, Brian. I love it. Not only is he angry and talking to the banana, but look at that left hand. He is having a very dramatic conversation. Mateo, I saw your sketch pad go up there. Awesome. There's the banana. We've got the CEO, and look at the size of the CEO compared to the audience. This is somebody who's really wanting to convey some drama. And then the sad story, the view from the back of the child's head. We're seeing the dog. The dog even has an expression. It's that sad a story. That's awesome. Thanks, Mateo. Who else? Okay, well, we had a couple very awesome drawings there. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Mateo. Last call for anyone else who wants to share off a sketch. All right, cool. All right, Brian, I'm gonna go back into Trent sharing mode here. I think the last thing I wanna share here, let's go to, there's a lot that we could talk about as it relates to color and comic books and that type of thing. We could spend 3 hours just doing that. I'm going to go just to this single slide here. And so these are the tools that I carry, some of the tools, when I go to do graphic recording. So that yellow and black kind of rectangle you see in the upper left, it's actually 4 rulers that are held together by these little black knobs. And so if you want to draw a box of a particular angle, you can tweak these knobs and turn it and trace it so you could draw a frame with different angles. Something I found on Kickstarter and I love to use. You can see there my 90-degree ruler that I take with me all the time. In the upper right are my circle stencils. These were actually handmade by Heather Martinez. Thank you, Heather. I take them everywhere. I love them. So if you ever just want to trace out a quick circle with marker or pencil or whatever, these slide right into my bag, and I love having those. The color wheel down on the lower left, if I'm stuck on color combinations and really want to do something, according to science, I know I'm using blue-green and I know I'm using yellow-orange, then this would tell me that red-violet might be a nice complementary color to fit into that triad. The middle thing you see here is a flip book. It's a photo album. It's 4 inches by 6 inches, and I have 6 of these. And inside of these are examples of my work and examples of other people's work. So Brian, I think actually that one of those there is a drawing that you did that really emphasized overlap. And I take these with me to graphic recording sessions. And when I'm hearing a topic, when I'm in the middle of a conference, I might flip to a page and say, you know what, that's a technique that I really want to use for this particular drawing or this particular conference. And these little photo albums have been amazing for me. There are also times before a conference where I might flip through and pick out 3 of these or 4 of these from all of those photo albums and going into the conference say, here are the 4 techniques I'm going to practice and get better at this particular conference or meeting. And then the last one on the lower right-hand side is a Japanese manga, a Japanese comic book. These are very character-driven, and I will take one of these with me because they contain so many really interesting expressions, and the drawings are oftentimes very simple. And so it's something that I've tried to emulate and showing people from different angles and with different expressions. So those are some of the tools that I carry along with my markers and things like that. So Brian, you've got your hand up, and I would be curious what tools others carry.
Yeah, so a couple of questions. One from Hannah is, actually she's got 2 of them. One of them is, do you ever vary limb size to indicate movement? And Hannah, just because I'm familiar with your work, that's something that I've observed you to do very effectively, almost as a way of underscoring and directing the viewer's eye to a subject that you want them to take a look at. So do you ever vary limb size to indicate movement?
Yeah, that's a cool idea. I haven't done a lot of that, but I'm going to now. I think the instance where I have done that is where I might want to show a character running or taking a step, where I've drawn the bottom of their shoe to be a much larger size compared to the rest of their body. I think I've also drawn characters with big heads, almost like those little plastic pop art characters that you can buy now that have a big head and a small body. You know, if I want to convey that expression or really want to talk about them being smart. Mateo asked about the flip books and using those in the moment. Yeah, there are times where somebody's talked about a topic and I've said, you know what, I know I've seen this conveyed somewhere, some way before, or a particular technique comes to mind, and yeah, I'll flip through that right away. I can think of an example just 2 weeks ago where the company's CEO stood up and his message was, you know, we're growing, we're adding more people. To be successful, I need to know what you want. Tell me what you want. So I drew him kind of from an angle where I was looking up at his chin as if he was standing in front of the audience and broadcasting that message outward. That was pretty cool. Somebody had asked about the tool in the upper left here. I don't know what it's called. I found it on Kickstarter. It's kind of a slide ruler type of thing. And Hannah says it is a multi-angled template ruler. That sounds good to me. That would be an MATR, the multi-angled template ruler. Thanks. That was Brian. Thanks, Brian. And Marcelin tells us that Amazon has them also, so they've jumped from Kickstarter to Amazon. It's a pretty cool tool. So we can talk more about tools. If anyone would like to hang out a little and talk about other things, I'll stick around.
I got one. So one of my favorite tools, I love Heather's templates. They get for the circles. One of my favorite tools is actually something called an arc compass, which is, if you imagine like an aluminum or a steel rod with a pin in the middle that you can move back and forth, and then a pencil on the other side, so you can do these really amazing big circles. And I can imagine, Trent, you using that with your frames.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And Hannah asked if I carry these rulers with me on all my gigs. Yeah, actually I do. And when I'm with Brian, he makes me carry all of his rulers and stuff too, which is fine. That's all right.
It's only fair.
So, beyond tools, anything else about comics and comic strips or any other takeaways? I'm curious, what advice would you give to others who weren't a part of this session? What would you tell them? Mateo says that the word here is commitment.
Which I'm not sure I spelled that right, but I'll work on that.
Yeah, I struggle with that one. That and judgment.
Double M, double T's, not so much sometimes. But there's a commitment here, right? There's when you're talking about using this style and calling out something with an overlay bubble and boxing something out. So I'm still working on that, trusting myself to commit to something.
Mm-hmm.
Or I'll over leverage the words, and then I'm going to fill in the visuals later. I'm still in that stage of my practice. Side note, I've watched you work, Trent, and you are super fast, and yet your movements are in slow motion. So I don't know how you manage to full time somehow. Your ability to, it's amazing.
Yeah.
You are the marker ninja. Yeah.
Actually, there's one sketch I want to share. If I could, let me go back to that. I think it's in the color section here. Yeah, there it is. There it is. Brian, I guess am I still on share? Are you still seeing my screen? You are, okay. So here's one that I did with Dean Myers. Obviously we threw in there like every comic book and cartoon character we could. This was done for a client who has appreciation of comic books. And so this, really hit his buttons there. And this is one that Dean and I did based on feedback that we were getting from people. It was, we have a facilitation technique that we call one-word checkout. And basically at the end of the day or in the end of a conference, we say to somebody, how are you feeling right now? And so all of the text you see here is their response. I feel motivated. I feel spent. I feel like we've got this. And I did the drawing and Dean did the coloring. And so to the idea, being able to crank one of these out in one session, Together and I, Dean and I did this, I think in about 1 hour, with me just drawing away and him going through with pastels and really filling it out. And, it was a really cool piece and really well-deserved. I'm sorry, not well-deserved, well-received is what I mean to say. And so to the idea of timing, yeah, it helps to have a partner there sometimes, especially someone like Dean who, does fantastic stuff like this. And Eric says, I like the back perspective. You're observing with us rather than a bunch of characters vying for the reader's attention at the same time. Yeah, that's a neat perspective on that. Hannah asks, wow, this one-word checkout that took a whole hour. I should clarify, Hannah. So the one-word checkout only took a few minutes. Our composition of all of this took about an hour. Yeah. I guess the missing step there is we had people putting their one-word checkouts on sticky notes, so we could do that quick harvesting there. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. All right. Well, Brian, we're close to 9 p.m. here. We want to do any final thoughts around the horn here, and talk about, you know, anything else that anyone would like to do. I'm happy to share the materials that I put together and send those out. You know, as you can tell, a lot of the examples in here are not examples that I own, but I did try to cite as much as I could. And so I'm happy to share this and other things with whomever would like to see it and hang on to it.
Mm-hmm. Trent, thank you so much for staying on an extra half hour. I don't want to be too greedy with your time. How about we open it up very briefly if there's any final questions, comments, takeaways. You had brought up one-word checkouts, and Marcelin says, fabulous. Any other one words or closing thoughts before we close? Inspired from Rachel. And it says, yes, would appreciate the slides as references. Thank you, Trent, for this excellent session. And staying extra, her word, inspired. Ben, possibilities, Constance, gratitude. Angie, thank you. I've been working on helping my viewers move through the flow of my notes better, and this was great. Ashanti, impactful. Mateo, impactful. Thank you so much, Trent. That was great.
Thank you.
And
Thank
it says
you,
Rich.
everyone. Yep. And glad to spend this time with you, and looking forward to seeing you in the next meetup here. We've got a couple coming up real soon.
Okay. Thanks, Trent.
All right. Thanks, everyone.